Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's Mishcon Academy session, part of a series of online events, videos and podcasts where we discuss the most important issues faced by society today. To introduce myself, I'm Molly Hunter. I'm a Managing Associate in the Private Wealth Disputes team here at Mishcon, and I will be hosting today's events. Before introducing Theo, I have some housekeeping points to mention. If you are online, you've been joined automatically on mute and without video. If you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and we will pick these up. If you're having any technical difficulties, please use the chat and just one of the Mishcon team will be able to assist you. If you have a question and you're in the room, please just raise your hand. Final point to mention, we are going to be talking about birth trauma today, and some of you may find this emotionally difficult and challenging, and Theo and I will be discussing where you can get help, and we will also share these resources with you afterwards. I know when I was going through recurrent pregnancy loss, it was a very lonely time, and this is why I have contributed to Theo's book and why I was also a guest on one of her podcasts. I wanted others to feel less alone. So let's begin. I am delighted to welcome my wonderful friend Theo. For those of you who don't know, Theo was the MP for Stafford from 2019 to 2024, and following the traumatic birth of her daughter in 2022, she set up and chaired the Parliamentary Birth Trauma Inquiry, which was the first of its kind. She is now an author and a podcaster. We have her book here, Breaking the Taboo, Why We Need to Talk About Birth Trauma, and her podcasts, which are also called Breaking the Taboo, have been renewed for a 4th, 5th and 6th series, which is amazing. Theo, you have so bravely spoken about your own experience, which has been incredibly important for so many women, and we will be talking about that. But where I want to start is going right back to early 2022, which is when we first met. You were about 20 weeks pregnant with Arabella, and I was 16 weeks pregnant with Rose. And a lot was going to happen for you in the next 6 months, notwithstanding the birth of your daughter. We were going to go through 3 prime ministers. There was the death of the Queen. And at the time when we met, you were also Boris Johnson's trade envoy to Kenya. So my first question is, what was it like being pregnant whilst in office?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me today, and thank you to Molly for so bravely sharing her story in my book, which we can talk about a bit later. But as Molly just alluded, I did not pick a quiet time of year to go off on maternity leave. In fact, if you were making a list of kind of most turbulent moments in British history, that would probably be up there for the last century. And that was the time that I had my baby in this very difficult period after birth. But Molly asked me a question about pregnancy, and it's good to start there because when I was elected in 2019, I obviously hadn't even met my husband yet, and I was not expecting to be having a baby whilst elected. And it's still incredibly unusual to have a baby whilst being an MP. So I was only the 56th MP in British history in 1,000 years to give birth while elected. And it became very clear to me that the system had not really been thought through for young mums. And I think that's because Parliament was really set up by older men who'd clearly not envisaged that Parliament would eventually have women of childbearing age being legislators. So if I could just give you a sort of story from early in the book. I remember very early on when I was several months pregnant, so in the kind of first trimester, very bad morning sickness, which I think every mum here would agree is normally all day and all night sickness, certainly not just in the morning. And Parliament's very unusual in that we have votes kind of called at any time of the day. So you have to be within 8 minutes walk of the House of Commons chamber when a vote is called. That means I can't even leave the building. I would take to having trainers to run to the doors because the doorkeepers actually lock you out if you miss a vote. You don't want to be the person that the government has lost a law because you did not make it to the chamber in time. But being pregnant was incredibly difficult because really there is no proper system for anyone to represent you and to do your job on your behalf. So I remember there was one night where we had the police and crime bill and we had a vote till 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was vomiting so heavily I couldn't actually go into the chamber to vote and to queue in the division lobby. And I think it's fair to say in any other workplace that would probably be a breach of the Equality Act if you were kept as a pregnant mum vomiting very heavily at your place of work. I remember going to see the chief whip at about 10 o'clock and saying, please, can I go home? And the answer was no, you need to be here to defend government business. And I was there till the middle of the night, sent home and came back again at 6 in the morning. So I really wanted to put some of those more personal stories in the book to really illustrate the point that, in my view, Parliament has got to modernise and change, because, in my opinion, it's not a fit 21st century workplace.
This is what I found so fascinating about the book, because I was expecting to read about the birth trauma inquiry and I was expecting to read about your traumatic birth. But what really surprised me and what I found so interesting was what it was like. And I think your book is fairly unique in that regard.
Well, you're absolutely right. So there have been a lot of political memoirs written, but the ones that you'll see in bookshops are normally outgoing prime ministers who are putting on the record what happened in their time of office, or very senior cabinet ministers. So there are very few memoirs by backbenchers. And I couldn't actually find a book about a backbencher who'd had a baby. So I believe this is the first time a memoir's been written specifically by a female MP about having a baby whilst holding public office. And I think it's really important that we talk about it, because I described some of the instances post-birth about really the challenges that I had being a sitting MP with, in effect, no acting deputy, which I think if we don't talk about, they will never modernise Parliament and they will never change. And that's why I partly wanted to get it on the record, was so that people did know what the challenges were.
I mean, there's this extraordinary juxtaposition between what was going on politically and what was going on in your pregnancy. And I think this particularly came to a point in the lead up to Arabella's birth. Can you share with us what happened?
I can tell from Wally's laugh that I know which chapter she's alluding to. So yes, it was a very strange time to be in the final kind of weeks leading up to my birth, because it was the time of Boris Johnson's administration going into crisis and the vote of no confidence being called in the Prime Minister. And so I wrote a chapter which I thought really illustrates this kind of juxtaposition between the personal and the professional, and the fact that you're basically never off duty as an MP. So I remember being sat in Stafford in my constituency in my midwife appointment on a Friday afternoon, and I was having my tummy checked for the heartbeat for my baby, and she couldn't find the heartbeat, and she said, "This is quite serious. My husband shouldn't wait for an ambulance. He should take me in the car 45 minutes to the nearest big hospital with an A&E to potentially have an emergency caesarean, because my daughter's heartbeat was skipping a beat." At the same time, I'm sat strapped in the table in with the midwife. My husband's BBC News alert goes off on his app, and it said that Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid had just resigned from the government as respectively the Chancellor and the Health Secretary. So you can imagine not a great situation for my own heartbeat, let alone my daughter's, that this is the exact moment I was sat in the midwife appointment. And I think it illustrates very well how challenging it was, because even though I was obviously very concerned about my daughter and being very heavily pregnant and having to go in traffic at rush hour with my husband to the hospital, I was actually dictating my vote of no confidence letter in Boris Johnson. I was drafting my resignation letter from the government, and I was basically sat in the maternity assessment unit, like frantically calling my team, drafting my letter, getting it signed, putting it on social media. And as it happened, I ended up not having a caesarean that evening and going home. But what an incredible 24 hours. And when I woke up the next morning, Boris Johnson was actually ousted as Prime Minister 2 days later. I was the 5th member of the government to resign out of 56 resignations over 2 days. But I did not expect to be doing that sat in A&E at my local hospital, very heavily pregnant. So that's partly also why I wrote the book, was to kind of show you really firsthand what a crazy experience it was to be a sitting MP in this extraordinary moment in British history, which was so turbulent. And I'd thought for a long time, Molly, about resigning. And that was probably the worst moment in my personal life I could possibly have picked to have to do it. But I think it illustrates very well that you're basically never off duty. There is always something that's going to happen with politics.
Yes, and then we come to the birth, and you have spoken very openly about it, and you describe in detail in the book what happened to you. But can you share with us today, as much as you would like, what happened?
Absolutely, and there's a lot more information in the book, but just for the purposes today, I'll keep it short. But basically, my daughter was 2 weeks late, and I ended up being induced. I went into hospital, was in labour for about 40 hours, which was a pretty grim experience in itself. But what happened was, when she eventually came out, I suffered from what I now know is a very significant birth injury, known as a 3rd-degree tear. And I had a hemorrhage after birth, so I lost a lot of blood, and I got rushed into the emergency theatre, and I spent over 2 hours awake in hospital being operated on. And I didn't meet my daughter for about 6 hours after birth because she was taken away from me. And I ended up spending about a week in hospital. And then it took me a long time to have specialist recovery, which we can talk about a bit later on mental and physical health. But I think the kind of moment that stays with me most from the hospital was kind of two things. Firstly, lying on the operating table, basically thinking I was going to die and that my husband thought he was going to be a single dad. And the second was when I eventually did come out and I was put into a side room. I was there with my daughter. I couldn't move. I was paralysed from the waist down. I'd just been in major surgery. And I remember pressing the emergency button for help. And this NHS nurse came in and she said, "Not my baby, not my problem." And she just walked out and left me there with a screaming baby that I couldn't pick up. And that was really the kind of start of what I know now as my future campaign, was that is completely unacceptable, that's the way I was treated as a patient at the most vulnerable time, post-birth, when you need the most help. And I've now subsequently discovered that, unfortunately, my experience was not unique, and that we do need to have quite a frank conversation, I think, about care within the NHS and compassionate care as well for new mums like myself.
Thank you very much for sharing that. You've talked about your birth injury, but did you know about birth injuries before you had your own? I mean, what were you told about in the run up to the birth?
Well, that is such a good question, Molly. Honest answer is not very much. And I remember when I was writing the book, I had a sort of box of like post-it notes and pregnancy journals and things that I'd collected over the previous year. And I found this post-it note from my NCT antenatal classes. And it literally said, for my hospital bag, make a Spotify playlist, bring your fairy lights and bring snacks. And looking back, I would say not the most useful advice that I ever received on pre-birth. And actually, I did take the time in those classes, which I did every week for several weeks with my husband, to specifically ask about risks and complications. And apart from basically being told about a C-section, nothing else was mentioned. And I was basically told, you will have a natural birth, your birth plan will be followed, and all these things, which I now know is actually not true. And in many cases is not going to be the case when women give birth.
Yeah, I think from my own involvement, there's this sort of, women can suffer sort of birth trauma, not just because of the physical, but because of a lack of information and lack of education provided antenatally. There's sort of this conspiracy of silence. You're just not handed the information that actually might be really helpful. So when you do end up in that very traumatic situation, you understand exactly what was going on. And I know certainly when I came to the birth of my third child, I knew exactly what was happening. So when I had the most unbelievably traumatic birth, I didn't suffer, apart from the fact I had a broken coccyx, I didn't suffer mentally, because I knew what shoulder dystocia was, and I knew that actually losing 3 litres of blood was quite a lot. And so I was able to kind of appreciate what was going on and understand what was going on, and that meant that I was okay. But I think especially if you're a first-time mum and you have not, none of this has been covered in antenatal class, I think it's really concerning. I mean, what do you think went wrong in the way that you were failed over your birth?
Well, kind of two parts to that answer. I'd say the first thing is, in some ways I had some good care. So I was quite lucky that Stafford had what's called a specialist perineal tear clinic. So because of my birth injury, I had to have months of rehabilitation, and I had to go to see a specialist NHS nurse basically every single week when I was back at work. But I then discovered subsequently that there is a real postcode lottery in maternity services. So if I'd been living in a constituency 100 miles down the road, they might not have had a tear clinic, and I wouldn't have been offered that specialist service. So in some ways I was quite lucky. But in other ways, as I described with the kind of the language of the staff, I do think, you know, giving birth on a busy ward on an August bank holiday weekend, where there's clearly just not enough people to be dealing with the volume of women who are going to labour on the same night, that I think there is a challenge about burnout within NHS staff. And that's something I've talked very strongly about with midwives, is to say, they should be better looked after, and I've always made the point that they need to have time and space when they're dealing with multiple traumas sometimes in the same 24 hours. But at the same time, we are people. We are not a number on a spreadsheet. And sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference. So someone coming in and saying, you know, are you okay? Holding your hand and saying, you've lost a lot of blood, but you're going to be okay. can I bring you a glass of water, and not leaving it 6 meters on the other side of the room when you can't walk, but leaving it on the table next to my bed. Like, these things actually don't require government funding. They're actually a case about compassionate care. And I think that's the conversation that we need to have, is like, why is it that we've lost that? And I do think there has been a sea change in the last generation, and we need to really think about why that's the case.
So you came home and you had these really quite horrific birth injuries. What support were you given locally in the NHS to help with your recovery?
So I mentioned the specialist hair clinic, but I was also had to be referred for mental health support for PTSD. And as you can imagine, being a sitting member of Parliament was a particular challenge. So I remember I'd been in hospital for 6 days, and I usually have on a Friday morning my constituency surgery, where constituents would come and see me in person about issues with, farming or their local schools, dealing with special educational needs, those kind of problems. And I started to receive abuse from constituents within the first week to say, we pay her wages, get back to work, you had your baby a whole week ago, why can't we meet you in person? Just for context, at this point, I hadn't left my bedroom. The only thing I left to go was to go to the toilet, because I had serious issues with incontinence post-birth and was bleeding so heavily I couldn't leave my house. So that's the kind of context that we're working within. And then I also hadn't quite realised that my mental health was really quite significantly impacted after the birth. And actually it was my husband, Henry, who kind of noticed at the time. So he said that I'd become obsessively OCD about our house. I mean, to the point that I was kind of picking up individual crumbs by the toaster, which he hadn't even noticed. He'd have a cup of tea and put it down, and I'd start cleaning straight underneath his mug and put it in the washing machine. And he said that you're kind of exhibiting what I now know as perinatal OCD. And I think now I know a bit more about birth trauma, that 30,000 women every year will suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder after having a traumatic birth. And I can give you another example. I remember the first time I went to see some mums in the pub for just a coffee, in my NCT class a few weeks after birth. And I think I only drove about 5 miles. So literally a few minutes drive from my house to the pub. And I was absolutely convinced that my daughter was stopping breathing in the car. And so I'd drive like 500 meters and I'd pull over, open the car door, go check her in the car seat, drive another 500 meters, stop, go and check her in the car seat. And by the way, she's absolutely fine. It's like a 5-minute drive, but I hadn't realized how that obsessive, like intrusive thoughts and checking. And I now know that's probably because we were separated for such a long time, that we didn't have that kind of golden hour of the breastfeeding, of the bonding for that first 60 minutes. But instead we had this very extreme separation where I didn't know what had happened to her. And in fact, when I started doing therapy, I remember doing one session where I very unexpectedly burst into tears, and all this grief came out, and it became apparent that I actually thought my baby had died in that 6 hours, because nobody had told me where she was and how she was. And that's why I started exhibiting that really extreme behaviour, which looking back now, I can see was so not my usual personality or how I'd usually behave. And that's why I had to get referred for mental health services.
I mean, going through all this, what was it like for Henry? What was it like for him looking after you, looking after Arabella? Because obviously you had a serious injury and you weren't very well.
Well, incredibly difficult is the honest answer. And the first thing to say is I basically required full-time care for the first many weeks after pregnancy. And the first thing I did was stop my mother-in-law coming to meet me and the baby for quite a while, which you can imagine was a real challenge. But I was not in any fit state to see anybody, let alone a constituent at that point. And really, my husband was amazing. I mean, he basically had to look after our daughter. One of the things I was unable to do was to breastfeed properly, partly because of my birth injury. I couldn't actually sit on my perineum to hold my daughter to breastfeed her. So I could only breastfeed lying down on one side. And that made it incredibly difficult. So very early on, I had to start pumping. And people don't tell you that when you have very heavy blood loss, it's actually very hard to breastfeed because your body is trying to recover from major surgery. Thinking about looking after the baby is kind of secondary. It doesn't want to produce milk. So really, the first couple of weeks, my husband had to pretty much do everything. And I do think that 2 weeks paternity leave is absolutely not enough. I mean, those of you who've had children, I mean, firstly, the first sort of couple of weeks as a newborn, you are literally up every 2 hours feeding your baby. So you're exhausted, and in my case, recovering from an operation on top. And then he had to go back to work after the 2 weeks, and we actually had to get professional help to come in and assist because I couldn't look after myself, let alone our daughter. And he also was really traumatised because when I went into surgery, I'd actually requested to have a general anaesthetic because I have a real needle phobia and I really didn't want to be in surgery, awake in an operation. And unfortunately, because I'd had the epidural, they actually refused me the general anaesthetic. So I had to be awake in surgery, being stitched up for over 2 hours, when a C-section takes around 20 minutes. And my husband ended up very bravely coming into the theatre with me and holding my hand, talking to me for 2 hours, keeping me conscious. And I think he's incredibly traumatised from that experience. And actually, when I wrote the book, I said it's so important that we hear from dads too, and I actually asked him and another dad to write their story down so you can read it in their perspective as the father. And he talks about that moment of seeing the doctors in the operation, where I think there was a junior doctor who was trying to stitch me up, and it obviously wasn't going well because it was a very significant injury. They described it as a bit like a butterfly. And he said that the senior doctor had to scrub up and come in and help during the operation. And he said they just looked at each other and he thought he was going to be a single dad. And he was offered no mental health support in the NHS because he was told he was not the patient. So I do think one of the things we need to look at is it's not just the mum who's the patient with birth trauma, but the partners in many instances are not being looked after as well. And they were there, they were present, they have PTSD too from what happened. And I think we should be offering mental health services to the fathers as well as the mums.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I know Henry had to do a huge amount, and obviously you mentioned breastfeeding and your struggles with breastfeeding. I think what I find quite ironic is that the lack of support you were given in relation to wanting to breastfeed, and the fact they hadn't told you anything about the fact that blood loss can impact your milk supply and everything. But if you hadn't struggled so much with that, then you wouldn't have been able to come down when the Queen died, which is what you had to do. And you brought along a cushion, didn't you?
I did. And I mean, that was extraordinary. So I had my daughter at the last week of August, having just had the leadership campaign over the summer. So I had the change of 3 prime ministers in the run up to my birth and then the aftermath of being in hospital. And then literally 6 weeks later, the Queen died. And again, what an extraordinary moment in kind of national history. You can't say as an MP, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not answering my phone today, I've been in hospital. Like, the monarch has just died. You need to be giving a statement, you need to be laying flowers in your church, you need to be responding to your team. So the entire time I was, quote unquote, on maternity leave, I was never on maternity leave because I was working the whole way through with my daughter. But we were invited down to London when the King came to speak at the address of House of Commons and the House of Parliament in Westminster Hall. And firstly, it was the first time I'd left my daughter, so I had to leave her for 2 days with my husband's bottle feeding. And I had that awful moment, Molly, you know, when like you're expressing, because you've got to keep up your milk supply, of going down to London and my mum had to drive me, and just putting all the milk down the sink, you know, in the petrol station, thinking I can't even give it to her because I'm not near enough to keep it refrigerated to give her the milk. And then the other thing was, because I couldn't sit properly, I had to have one of those donut cushions to support me. And I remember when I arrived in Westminster Hall, it fits maybe 1,000 people. So the King's arriving, you've got all the dignitaries, all of the cabinets, very, very senior politicians. And I'd been given a seat right at the front with, you know, most of the senior politicians in my party who was in the government. And I got there and I realised I couldn't even walk that far. So I literally had to sit on the back row and then I had to sit on my donut cushion, which I ended up having to take into Prime Minister's questions. I'd always kind of hide it in a bag because I had to sit on it. Because as you can imagine, the green benches are actually quite narrow and very uncomfortable. So that was kind of one of the things I had to do. And I do think that's something we don't really talk about, is kind of going back to work and how challenging it can be. And there's quite a lot of adjustments sometimes that you do need. And for me, having that was really important. And what's interesting is that at the time, I didn't tell anyone, right? So I didn't tell anyone about my birth injury. I'd hide the cushion in a bag. And then it was only like 2 years later, I then started talking about it. And now I'm happy to openly share it. But that was partly because I was so traumatized that I didn't feel like I could tell anyone. And I do think there is a big stigma about speaking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I've just returned to work and 3 weeks in, and as I mentioned, I dislocated my coccyx when my daughter was born. It's still quite painful, so I've got to get a cushion to sit on. So for those of you, you'll probably see my cushion. But yeah, we don't talk about it enough. But it's fair to say that in the 6 months that you were off, you did a huge amount of work, and you probably did more work than most government ministers who run very busy departments. Tell us what happened the week you returned from maternity leave.
Yeah, well, if I just go back a minute first before I get to that story, but I mentioned that MPs don't get maternity leave like normal members of the public. Well, first of all, what an extraordinary sentence. So we are the government's legislators making the laws, which you all follow as businesses like Mishcon, and they don't actually apply to us, which I think is extraordinary in itself. And that's one of the things I wanted to draw attention to in the book. So I was quite lucky in some ways that the UK Parliament, Dove has a system for what's called a proxy vote. So for 6 months post the birth, I didn't have to come down to Parliament to vote in person. I had another member of the government who would call me every day and say, tonight's votes are X, Y, and Z. How would you like to vote? And every day they would still have to check with me, and I'd have to look at the legislation. And then on all of the amendments, I'd decide how to vote, and they'd vote on my behalf. So I had that for about 6 months. And then it actually got extended because of the extent of my injuries and the number of hospital appointments I had to have. And the reason why that's so important is because otherwise you're basically tied to being 8 minutes from the chamber. So you couldn't go see your daughter, you couldn't be breastfeeding, you're basically tied to the actual physical building of Parliament. So I had that for 6 months. Went back to Parliament on the Monday morning. I actually got offered a new job in the government, so I became the Parliamentary Private Secretary for the Department for Business and Trade. Had a really busy first day. My boss was actually Kemi Badenoch, who at the time was the Trade Secretary. And then having obviously not been in Parliament for 6 months, I had this crazy kind of first 4 days of meetings and trying to catch up. And I went back to Stafford on the Friday, having basically not seen my daughter for like 4 days. Got on the train back, did a whole day in Stafford, did constituency surgery appointments, tried to see as many people as possible. I think I went to my local college and opened one of their new institutes. And then in the evening, I had my readoption meeting for Stafford Conservatives to stand again as their Member of Parliament. And normally as the sitting MP, that's a pretty straightforward process. You just go, give a 10-minute speech on kind of what you've been working on for the previous few years, and then ask for the executive to vote for you again. So I didn't really think anything of it. I was more kind of overwhelmed by first week back, separated from my daughter. The commute going back from London to Stafford is exhausting in itself with a baby. And I turn up to the meeting at 7 o'clock and there were maybe 30 people in the room out of about 800 members. And I didn't recognise about 2/3 of them. But I did know that my constituency had changed quite a lot of boundaries because of the Boundaries Commission report. And they had the vote. I gave my speech. And I got deselected as the sitting Member of Parliament 4 days after I came back from maternity leave because I had not been visible enough as the local MP. Yeah. Yeah. So then there was a whole battle about getting reselected, and then I did become again the candidate. But I think it illustrates very well that politics is not set up for working young women, and that's partly why I wrote the book, is to challenge that, and that's why I wrote about it for a whole chapter, to say that is not acceptable. I am entitled to take maternity leave as a sitting politician, and we need to have a frank discussion about that, because I do think it impacts on policy. Because if you don't have young women like me who've got a baby as an MP, we won't be talking about women's health, we won't be talking about birth trauma, we won't be talking about ovarian cancer, all these things that probably an older man who's an MP is probably not going to be talking about. So I actually do think there's an impact on democracy, and that's why I wanted to write about it.
Yeah, and you've been incredibly brave in relation to what you've done. And I think most women, if they've been through what you've been through, would not want to talk about it anymore. I think certainly returning to work, you become a different person, really, to the person you've been when you've been on maternity leave. And that's very difficult in itself. But you came back to work. And given what you have been through, what was the turning point that made you want to do something that made such a difference?
Well, let me start off by saying, so I never expected to leave Parliament being best known for being an NHS campaigner. Not my expertise. Anyone who'd asked you would say that my background is foreign affairs and international relations. I gave my maiden speech in the Global Britain debates. I was on an international committee. I had an international appointment from the Prime Minister. So that was very much my kind of interest in terms of policy. And really, I knew nothing about NHS policy at all before I started this campaign. But I remember there was two very specific turning points that happened. The first was in my constituency in Stafford, where I'd been on my maternity leave for a few months, still doing constituency visits. And I remember going to St George's Hospital, and they have a veterans wing for, former veterans with PTSD, but they also had a mum and baby unit. And at this time, I'd not spoken about what had happened to me, but obviously the hospital director knew that I had a baby. So they said, would you like to come and meet some of the mums? And I remember going into this mum and baby unit and meeting these mothers who'd suffered from postpartum psychosis after birth, which is not the baby blues and normal postnatal depression. This is a very extreme situation which needs to be medicalised and actually put into an extreme hospital environment or a psychiatric unit after birth. And I remember one of the mums, who was now a bit better, saying how when she first arrived at the unit, she didn't recognise her child, her new baby, and she went around the NHS staff offering her baby, saying, please take this baby away, I don't know who this is. And that was her own baby. And that was the full scale of the kind of mental breakdown that she'd had post-birth. And I remember writing a speech to talk about it in Parliament and looking up about, the amount of money we spend on mother and baby units. And I discovered that there were only 18 in the country, and I just happened to have one in Stafford. So I think I'd made the assumption that all 650 constituencies had it, and then realised that I was very unusual, that I did have one in the Midlands. So firstly, I kind of started thinking, well, who's looking after the mums in places that don't have them? And then there was a second moment where I reached out to the Birth Trauma Association on Facebook, who was one of the first charities that I came across when I was partly looking for support for myself as a mum, but also wanted to learn a bit more about kind of the policy area, and they did a lot of campaigning on maternity. I remember their chief exec, Kim, came to see me in the parliamentary office. I literally sent her this random message on Facebook, and she'd obviously looked me up and was thinking, who's this backbench MP who has literally never spoken in a maternity debate? Why does she want to talk to me? And at this point, I'd obviously not spoken about my birth. She just knew I had a baby. And she brought in 20 mums to meet with me for a coffee. And we spent 2 hours, and they just sat and shared their stories, from everything from birth injuries, being a police officer with a 4th-degree tear who'd lost her job, been sent home undiagnosed, one of the stories I included in the book. Other mums like yourself, Molly. There was basically such a clear pattern in listening to their stories that it didn't really matter where they were living in the UK. They all had patterns in their care where they'd either been misdiagnosed, not listened to, sent home without support. And I basically said to them, well, who's supporting your campaign, and who's the minister and the MP doing something about this? And they were like, you're the only person that's taken a meeting with us. And I said, you must be joking. Well, who is listening to you in the government? And that's why I decided to set up the all-party parliamentary group on birth trauma in the House of Commons, was that I really felt that this was an issue which society needed us to talk about and needed politicians to talk about in a cross-party way. And there basically wasn't anyone doing it. So it kind of felt incumbent on me, as someone who'd been through a similar experience and then met these mothers who'd had these terrible times, to actually try and do something about it.
I think just incredibly important. The birth trauma inquiry was incredibly important, and what I found so remarkable, my contribution in relation to your book and your podcast was in relation to the recurrent pregnancy loss and going through that, and the PTSD I had because of that. But I think you were very brave, because you had to listen to a lot of evidence in relation to the inquiry. How did you manage that in relation to the fact that you've been through this personally?
Yeah, well, kind of two things on that. Firstly, the birth trauma inquiry idea that I had was because I'd seen in Australia that in New South Wales they had done this big select committee into birth trauma and listened to mums across Australia to hear their patterns in care. And I was a backbencher. I was in the governing party, but I was not a sitting minister. But I knew that in order to get the Prime Minister's attention and the Health Secretary's attention, it was very important to have a large volume of submissions from the public to say, here's the weight of evidence, you can't ignore it. So that was kind of the first impetus for it. And how I got all the stories was very unexpected. So I started this debate in October of that year, sort of a year after I gave birth. And I remember firstly going into the House of Commons committee to basically where you pitch to the Speaker to ask for chamber time to talk about subjects. And my pitch was very simple. I had looked at other people's debates to speak in, and I couldn't find one on birth trauma, which I found very surprising. And I went into the committee and I said, in 1,000 years of our British Parliament, we have never held a debate on birth trauma, and I think it's time that we did. So I got allocated 3 hours of chamber time in the House of Commons. And I spent time obviously meeting a lot of charities like MASIC and BTA and others. And I kind of wrote my speech. And I'd written a 20-minute speech, and I'd been talking to the minister about adding in birth trauma to the women's health strategy. And the thing I hadn't expected, Molly, was that I went into Parliament, my place of work, very professional, in my suit, had written out my speech, all my policy recommendations. I had my husband sat in the top on the rows above the chamber, and I had about 30 mums who'd come to support my campaign. And I started talking about my birth trauma experience of what happened to me. And completely unexpectedly, I actually burst into tears, like live on TV on the BBC in the chamber. And it was a really quiet Thursday. And most people are not watching the chamber of the House of Commons, like just live on BBC Parliament. But what happened was the BBC clipped me bursting into tears. And suddenly within an hour, it had just gone completely viral everywhere, to the point that I came out the chamber and friends in Sydney, Australia were texting me saying, we've just seen you on the International World BBC News. So suddenly everyone had seen my speech. And what I hadn't anticipated was that basically within 24 hours, thousands of mums like yourself started writing to my parliamentary office to say they'd had incredibly similar experiences on mental health, physical health, babies that had died due to medical negligence and others. And that's really what turned me into this big campaign on maternity, was seeing the scale of the problem. This wasn't just those 20 mums that I first met for a coffee. This was suddenly thousands of women writing to me, and I wanted their stories to be captured in the birth trauma inquiry so that politicians would ultimately take better policy decisions to try and improve care so that really it didn't happen again, what had happened to them.
Yes, and this is what you did, and the person who wrote the report, Dr. Kim Thomas, did an amazing job. What were the key findings of the birth trauma inquiry?
Yeah, so the report was much bigger, firstly, than we anticipated. So ended up being about 82 pages with 40 recommendations in it on how to improve policy. I think the first thing was we discovered that there was really this kind of pattern of mums not being listened to in the NHS. And that was such a clear story that we heard from all parts of the devolved nations, that women were saying something was wrong, like they might ring the hospital multiple times, and then either they weren't being called back or they weren't being treated seriously. And then in the worst case instances, babies were dying because they'd actually not been brought into the hospital and something had gone wrong. So that was the first thing, was mothers not being listened to. Then it was very clear that there was this postcode lottery where, as I described with my TARE clinic, I was lucky, right, that I did have access to a specialist doctor, but other parts of the UK don't have the same. And a bit like with the mum and baby units, there was one in Stafford, but again, not in, say, Northern Ireland. So you'd be separated as a mum from your baby in the mainland. I mean, that is extraordinary to me, that there is no provision in Northern Ireland. So one of the things we looked at was how can you actually address that point of this fragmentation in care? And I think we tend to talk about the National Health Service. It's actually not a National Health Service. There are individual trusts who will interpret guidance in a particular way. Firstly, a lot of maternity guidance is guidance only. It is not mandatory. How your hospital chooses to interpret is up to them, their local demographics and the things that they think are most important for their local areas. So one of the things that we decided to call for were kind of two things. The first was we thought that there should be a standardised maternity policy. So I remember writing to number 10 as the chair of the inquiry and saying, can I please have a copy of the government's maternity strategy? So obviously we can read it for the report. And the answer was, we don't have one. You need to refer to all these different websites. And I remember asking a doctor in St George's Hospital, and he told me as an obstetrician on the front line on a ward, he would refer to 80 different places to work out what the policy was for him as a doctor in the hospital. I thought, how crazy is that the government and a doctor cannot actually tell me what our maternity policy is? This is part of the problem. So we asked for a national maternity improvement strategy, which would then be a standardised approach across all NHS hospitals. And the other thing we've asked for, which I'm campaigning very hard on, is to have a maternity commissioner. So there have been about 700 recommendations from previous inquiries, so not just mine, but looking at things by the Care Quality Commission, what Donna Ockenden is doing in hospitals in Nottingham and Leeds and others, and many other reports by Bill Kirkup and Ace Kent and others, and they've not actually been implemented. So everything I'm talking about, in a way, is not new. Donna Ockenden has said it before. Bill Kirkup has said it before. All of these reports in the last 10 years have pointed out incredibly similar themes, but no one is actually implementing them. And I think it's partly because government reshuffles happen so frequently that you get a new minister coming in with a different set of priorities, women's health gets deprioritised, they don't do anything about maternity policy, and nothing happens. So what we've called for is a maternity commissioner, because they in effect would not be tied to election cycles, tied to government appointments and a reshuffle, but it would be an actual real person whose job it is to oversee and implement those recommendations. So please do sign our petition, which I've launched with Louise Thompson last week. We already had 25,000 signatures in the first 7 days. and that means we will get a response from the government. But if we get to 100,000 signatures, they will actually consider having a debate in the House of Commons because so many of the public have called for it. And I really think from a policy perspective, that is really essential. Like, isn't that insane that that many recommendations from previous inquiries have not learned the lessons and done anything about it? So we need somebody whose job it is to make sure they're actually taking the action afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's really important, particularly in light of the news today. The government has announced that there needs to be a call for evidence in relation to improving maternity care. I
literally rolled my eyes. So just to explain the current context. So the new Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, has said that maternity services keep him up at night and it's a top priority. He announced that Baroness Amos, a member of the House of Lords, would chair this new maternity investigation. My concern with that was, as I've just described, there have been so many inquiries. Mums like Molly came forward and gave evidence to me in Parliament as a result of our own inquiry. And I actually don't think we need any more public calls for evidence, which is what the government have said again today. They have put out a message on their website to say, please come forward as mums who've had bad experiences of birth, and we want to hear from you. I think what I would say, and many other families who've had a difficult time, they've given evidence multiple times, which in itself is quite re-traumatising to have to go through it again, whether it's written or verbal. But also they're losing faith and trust in the system, because if you came forward and gave evidence to me 2 years ago, and then none of those policy recommendations you can see are being implemented, why would you do it again? And why would you believe that the government is committed and is going to make the difference? So that's why I think there are changes they can make today, like appointing the maternity commissioner, which don't require yet another listening exercise for the public. We actually know what the problems are in maternity care. We just need someone to do something about it today, which they could choose to do.
I mean, why do you think women's health policy and maternity care, why do you think all this is ignored in Parliament?
Well, honest answer is that the demographics in the House of Commons. I mean, Harriet Harman has been very supportive of my campaign, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, and she was describing to me how when she first got elected, I think she was one of like 5 MPs who were female in her intake, which is relatively short history, right, that we're talking about in the last few decades. And they've just reached the highest proportion of women MPs ever in Parliament's history, which is fantastic across all the parties, which is at nearly 1/3. But the bottom line is women's health is deprioritised, women's health is not funded as much. We basically spend about 1% on women's health, and we spend money on other things which are, in my view, more rare, less likely to happen. If you take birth, every single person in the UK is going to be born. So if I was the health secretary and I had to pick 3 things that were in my top 3, I would put birth as one of the top 3. Not every single person is going to get cancer. Not every single person is going to end up in a car crash, but every single person is going to be born. So that's why maternity really should be in the top 3 priorities for the government. And it goes back to my earlier point about partly the reason I wrote this chapter at the end of the book on modernising Parliament is that I don't feel Parliament is family friendly, and therefore that women are not going to put themselves forward if they want to start a family, because it is crazy hours. You are tied to the chamber of the House of Commons. You are living in 2 places. Where are your children going to go to school? You will not be attending parents' evening because you're voting late at night. You will be going to bed at 1 in the morning. Is that a friendly workplace to try and attract young women to go into work? No, I don't think it is, and I don't think anyone talks about that. But the knock-on effect on policy is huge. And I'll just give you an example from Obama. I remember he gave a very good speech when he was president of the United States, and his daughters were obviously lobbying him very heavily on women's issues. And I remember he abolished the tampon tax. So there was no tax on razors, and there was a tax on tampons. And he always used that, I thought, as a really good example of why policy matters. It's because men were deciding the laws, and that's why there was a tax on the female product and not a tax on the male product. And that's why you've got to have female policymakers, because there's a reason, right, you didn't ever have a debate on birth trauma until I led it in the House of Commons, because you had a woman who'd had a baby and had had that experience. If I'd been a 60-year-old man, would I have been talking about it in the same way? Probably not. And that's why representation matters, because these issues matters to my constituents in Stafford. They matter to the public, and I don't think they're being talked about or invested in enough.
Do you think, are they doing anything about this? Are they sort of aware of how difficult it is? And is anyone looking at policy change in relation to what it's...
Well, yeah, I can give you a good answer and a bad answer. So some positive changes. So firstly, on the parliamentary nursery, Parliament a few years ago did decide to bring an on-site nursery into the House of Commons, which was originally designed for MPs because so few people were having babies, and because of the breastfeeding situation, you obviously wanted to have your child with you in Parliament. I discovered that when I applied to the parliamentary waiting list, that the waiting list was a year long. I went to see the speaker and explained to him that science is that your baby will take 9 months to grow. So that would mean I'd have to put myself on the waiting list for Parliament's nursery before I knew I was pregnant, and no one has pointed this out. So actually, as a sitting MP that the parliamentary nursery was designed for, I couldn't actually access it. And that also has ramifications for breastfeeding, because if you can't have your baby in with you when you're voting, then obviously you won't be able to breastfeed. So I actually made a complaint about that, and I understand they have actually now changed it. So the MPs in the new intake after me, they now do have first choice to get into that. And I think partly the reason was several thousand contractors who were parliamentary security cleared for the parliamentary estate had access to the nursery, and MPs were not given precedence, where we're the only ones voting at 1 o'clock in the morning, not my staff who go home at 6 o'clock. So I really did think that we should be in a different category, which we were. But there is so much more that they could do to improve Parliament, starting with not keeping heavily pregnant women very late during voting hours. I would say start with that if you're going to pick one thing to improve.
I mean, yeah, just crazy to think about.
Yeah.
I think what I'd like to turn back to now is just talking about what support is out there for mums like you who've suffered birth injuries, and whether there's anything in particular you would like to signpost.
Yeah, such a good question. So firstly, I would say it's really important to seek help. Like, I didn't tell anyone for a really long time what had happened to me. I mean, even some of my closest friends were like, until you gave your speech in the House of Commons, we had no idea how bad it was and how traumatised you still were after all that time. And that's because I do think there is a real shame and a stigma about talking about things that go wrong in childbirth. And that's why I called my book Breaking the Taboo, and why I called my podcast the same, is that I do think I did break a taboo by speaking about it in the House of Commons, and now going on Women's Hour and lots of news and talking about this very publicly. And I hope by doing that, it helps other women to feel less alone if they've had a similar experience. And I do find it really very moving when I have women write to me, sometimes who had birth trauma 10, 20, 30 years ago, and they might have heard my speech on the radio or seen me talking about it, and they haven't even told their partner or their husband after 3 decades how bad their birth injury was, and it's affected their marriage, their ability to have sex, all these other things, and they just didn't feel able to talk about it. So that's my first point, is do share, it's really important. And secondly, there are a number of charities out there who are really fantastic as a resource. And the first two that I signpost people to are the Birth Trauma Association. What I really like about them is that they've got a fantastic Facebook group, but you actually have a real mum like me who will reply to you, and they will be empathetic, they will be compassionate, they will actually relate to your experience because they're a mum who's had something similar happen to them. And they'll be able to make you feel less alone and to signpost you to a specific resource. It's also quite complicated, right? Navigating the NHS and all the different systems that you're signposted to. So they can give you advice on that. And the second would be MASIC, which is a birth injury charity, which I'm a patron for. And again, they're really good for kind of more practical advice on things like, do you need to have surgery if, for example, your tear wasn't stitched up properly at the time? And they can give you kind of more specific advice on going back to work and dealing with issues like incontinence and other things that, again, we just don't talk about. So those are two really good charities that I recommend. And obviously my podcast, because every week we have on doctors, nurses, mums talking about all this kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, I would say the podcasts are fantastic. And yeah, I mean, 4th, 5th and 6th series, they're doing really well, and you've got a huge audience. But where I think they're particularly good is, yes, each episode focuses on something different. So you've got an episode on postnatal depression, and you've got an episode on tears, and you've got an episode on NICU babies. And I know lots of people in this room have had NICU babies. I mean, 2 out of my 3 children were NICU babies, and I think just listening to the beeps and trying to turn off the monitors and not being sure whether you should be turning off the monitors and how that works in relation to breastfeeding if your baby's tube fed, all these sort of things you cover in your podcast. And I think if you've been away on maternity leave and then coming back to work and actually thinking about having a moment, because you've been so busy on your maternity leave, having a moment when you walk out to get lunch, I think it can actually be quite difficult, because suddenly it's like, oh, well, this is what I went through, and this was quite difficult for me. So, yeah, I think it's really important to share and to speak to others I think it can be very helpful. But my final question, what are you working on next?
Well, I'm actually writing my next book at the moment, which is looking more at kind of birth and complications, because I think what really struck me walking into bookshops was that there's so many books on kind of pregnancy and, you know, how to wean your baby and things post-birth and feed your baby, but there's not a huge amount on kind of physical and mental recovery post-birth. So that's the sort of new project that I'm working on. And then, as I said, the podcast has got much bigger than we expected, which I think just shows how no one was really talking about this stuff. And I gave this as an experience at our podcast party for our anniversary, which Molly came to. I remember when I was a mum and I was looking for something to listen to. And all of the big podcasts are things like Happy Mum, Happy Baby, which are really fantastic podcasts. But I remember thinking, I'm unhappy. What podcast is there for me? And that was really the impetus of, like, you know, a lot of mums have seen my story and are asking me for help. And I'm so conscious that I'm not a healthcare professional and I'm not able to give you health advice. But I also didn't want to leave them that they didn't have a response, and that I had taken the time to read their story and to point them in the right direction. And what I hope the podcast has done is that actually they then can look at the particular topic they're interested in and then listen to the expert. So I'm not the expert, but I'm interviewing the expert, so that hopefully they can get the questions like Molly's just described with premature babies.
Well, thank you very much, Theo. This has been amazing. Thank you for coming in to talk today. Does anyone have any questions?
They're all shocked into silence. No. One at the back.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I have a question about in culture of induction. I know the birth cultures now, this induction has become very prevalent. I don't know if you have any views on the correlation between induction and birth trauma, birth injuries.
A very good question. So firstly, induction varies hugely in different countries, which I find interesting in itself. So why do they think at different due dates you should be induced in, say, France versus the UK, and they all have a slightly different rate? So there is no standard common denominator across every single country about what that should be. And I do think because women are having births older, where they have probably a higher risk profile, they're therefore also more likely as well to be induced and probably to end up with a more medicalised birth. And it goes back to Molly's earlier question about what I knew. None of this stuff was talked about in antenatal classes. Like, you're basically just assumed you will push your baby out and you will have a natural birth. And that's what I was very much led to believe. And many of the mums I speak to, that's what they're told. And the brutality of induction I found really quite horrific. I mean, I was quite graphic about it in the book, but I kind of wanted to make the point of, like, it was almost like being in a kind of an animal factory where you were, you know, 6 people in a room. All of you were just kind of shared hanging wool blankets like this, and you could hear you all at different stages of labour just being pumped and pumped through with drugs. And I think people don't realise that when you're being induced, it's not natural contractions in the same way. So you can end up having these incredibly intense, incredibly strong contractions where the pain is absolutely excruciating. And I was quite lucky that I was given an epidural, but so many mums end up being induced and then not offered pain relief, either because they're not being listened to or because they're told that they've gone past the point that they could be offered it. So I do think that we really need to think about what education mums are getting in pregnancy. And in my personal view, they shouldn't be ignoring induction. It should be on every single course that you're offered. And I also think we shouldn't be charging mums to go to antenatal classes. In the old days, that was part of what you were offered within your NHS Trust service. Like, I was incredibly lucky that I could afford to pay for a class. Most of my constituents, that's not the case. So what's happening in that scenario if they don't speak English as their first language? So I personally think that antenatal classes should be mandatory. They should be provided for free as part of your hospital, and it should include things like that. And I think there is a wariness about discussing risks and complications, to which I have absolutely no truck. I think we've got to talk about these things, because as Molly just very eloquently described, when something goes wrong, all the science and evidence shows that you actually have less birth trauma if you know to expect something going wrong. It's when you have completely idealistic expectations that everything will go as per your birth plan, and then it doesn't happen, that's when they're getting more traumatised. So let's try and help women by giving them the information, because I do think it empowers them in the first place.
Thanks. I'm going to take a moment. I'm just speechless because there's so much important stuff that you've covered, and thank you so much, Theo, for speaking and sharing and being the campaigner, and Molly for facilitating this, because I think this is just an incredibly important discussion and area. I'm in a team with various people here of mainly women a leadership team, all women, and loads of mums. And loads of our associates are mums returning from maternity or about to go away on maternity. Obviously, I think the answer to this question will differ depending on the workplace, but do you have some insight or some top wishes for how a workplace, whether it's a firm like this, not in the specific parliamentary sphere, because we've obviously heard a lot about that, how can we be supporting in a practical way, in a way that we maybe aren't already? Do you hear that from the stories from the people that have come to you?
Well, first, I'm really pleased that you asked about that, because I think one of the things, if I look at kind of comments that come in on social media that mums write to me about a lot of the time, is about going back to work. So what do they do in the scenario that they're basically not physically or mentally well enough to go back after their maternity leave has technically finished? And they need to have that quite difficult conversation sometimes with their employer about how to extend it, when they maybe don't want to explain what's happened to them in the detail that I have. And I do think there's another point about not every employer is probably as good as Mishcon is, from what I hear from Molly, that you guys were particularly good and quite understanding. And I know Molly was able to extend her paternity leave, for example. But I do think it's very dependent on the employer, and actually the fact it's so discretionary is a problem, because what happens if you have a boss who's a guy and who doesn't take it seriously and doesn't actually think that, you know, you have major issues post-birth and thinks you should just be back in the office and that's that. So I think first we've got to have the conversation about it, and also we've got to put the onus back on employers to say it should be your job as the employer to help to accommodate mums like me and Molly, where we don't actually need much. Like if Molly and I need a cushion to sit on at work in our workplace, in my case, I need to make sure I have regular access to toilet breaks if I'm in a meeting. These are all quite little things, but for us are really important. So like I remember when I used to leave the house, I'd literally plan every single toilet stop if I was having to take the train, sitting in the car, worrying about being stuck on the motorway, because I had such problems with holding my bowels. And that's always something I'm happy to talk about now. But at the time, I was going on government trips where I was on a flight for 12 hours, and I was, you know, in Kenya where there was no access to proper toilet facilities. And I literally had to sit down with the ambassador and say, you know, we've got 3 days of trade deal negotiations. I need to know where the toilet breaks are for the next 72 hours. And because I had a female ambassador, she was really compassionate and really thoughtful, and she sat down and looked at my itinerary, and we made sure we planned in regular stops for me. And I was able to have that conversation with her. But I think it's incredibly difficult, right, for people to sit down and have that conversation with their employer. So I think Mishcon is to be commended for being quite helpful and supportive of employees. But I do think that's not the case with every company in the UK, and I think it should be mandatory. They have to think about these things.
Yeah, and deliberate. So,
yeah.
And we don't need policy to do that.
No.
As leaders, we need to be deliberate about the conversations.
Yeah, and that's about culture, right? Because you don't need a government piece of legislation to tell you all to do that necessarily as a company. But what we need to have in the country is to have the frank, honest conversation, which I think having my debate and doing the inquiry and doing the book has started that national conversation. And the fact that I'm even here today talking to a corporate where you're all thinking about this shows that the conversation is starting to change and that you're all thinking about it. I'm very pleased to see that there are some men in the audience as well, which I think is a really important point, because they are part of the conversation too, and they need to know about the real challenges that we face as new mums so that they can start thinking about it and how to support their teams, because ultimately change starts from the top, and you do need to have leaders that care, and that's where the change will come from.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions online. We'll just squeeze in
Yeah,
one
yeah.
more
Before we finish, do you think that if an MP was recovering from major surgery that was not birth related, like you were, they would have been expected to come down to London when the Queen died? Ultimately, do you think that birth is minimalised?
Well, firstly, the second part of that question, yes. And the example I always give, and I've said this many times in the inquiry and elsewhere, is if you have a caesarean section, you are having major abdominal surgery. If you had a car crash and you had major abdominal surgery, you would be sent home for several weeks and you would not be expected to pick anything up, and someone would be looking after you. When you have a baby, you are picking up your baby like hundreds of times a day, which you really shouldn't be doing with a major scar and trying to recover from surgery. So why do we think it's acceptable when you've got the baby to look after and you've also had the surgery, but not in the car crash scenario where you would be given more support, where in effect, I would say out of the two patients, it's the mum who's also got to look after the baby, who in effect needs double the amount of support. So I think you're absolutely right, we do minimise it. And I think there's been this kind of expectation in society that, and I very much had that expectation during pregnancy. I literally thought, I remember having my team come to my house and we kind of sat down and looked at my first 6 months and I was like, yep, I'll be available on WhatsApp week 1, then I'll be available on the telephone week 2, then I'll be doing constituency surgery appointments because I'll obviously be in Stafford for 6 months, so we can pack in loads of those. For the first 6 months, I'll just bring the baby. Like, none of those things happened, right? Because I was not in any fit state to do anything. And I just had this expectation that I would just give birth, naturally start breastfeeding. Within a few hours, I'd be walking around, I'd be straight home. My husband would go back to work after 14 days and I'd be looking after the baby full time on my own with no problem. And that is back to the point about society and expectations, that I was led to believe that is the case. Because when you watch TV, when you read a book, when you go into a bookshop, these are what you're led to believe is the kind of idealistic representation of birth. And that's partly why I wrote my story down, was to say, that is actually doing a disservice to women by not telling them the truth. And I really think that we should tell women the truth and we should empower them with the information, because a lot of people, yes, will give birth and have a good time, but a lot of people won't. And who's talking to them? And I don't think we've been having that conversation before now.
Well, thank you so much, Theo, for coming and talking to us today. I think everyone would agree it's been very insightful and quite moving as well. I think it's really important that all this is talked about, that we are breaking the taboo and that we are talking about birth trauma. And my final thing to say is everyone needs to sign your petition. Very important. So thank you, Theo.